So welcome again, everybody. This is Ken Smith. I am the managing editor of Building Financial Resilience for an Uninsurable Future. This is our podcast series, Resilience in Action. And today we're going to be talking with the Resilience Action Fund. So we have with us Aris Papadopoulos, the founding chair of the Resilience Action Fund. So Aris, would you like to introduce yourself and the fund and what you folks do and sort of give us a little primer in terms of what brought you here and what are some of the changes you're seeing that make this work so important right now?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Ken, for having me on this podcast. I mean, these educational media are very important for consumers, I believe. I'm a veteran of the construction industry and also World Trade Center 9/11 survivor. And since retiring, I kind of dedicated the next phase of my life to educating consumers on becoming a bit smarter, let's say, when they buy, when they renovate, when they select to live in a certain place and location. Now, we've seen a lot of people in the last 2, 3 years move from the north to the south and buy up properties without really knowing the vulnerability of what they're buying. And a lot of those people are in for a rude awakening. This guide was developed, in fact, before COVID, to be a friend, let's say, an expert that a consumer can turn to and get some advice. Like having me essentially close to them and saying, okay, check this, look at that, because unfortunately the property industry, the agents, the sellers, they're not interested in the outcome in the future, what the new owner will face. So it's really a buyer's beware property market, and this is intended to help consumers ask the right questions, do their own research, check things before they fall in love with a house. Before you make an offer, particularly, because by then it's kind of late. You're kind of scurrying to get the financing, and maybe you're planning already got your old place on sale. So this work has to be done up front, starting with the location, the neighborhood that you pick, because that's half of the challenge, being in a resilient location.
So you talk about the neighborhood you pick. There are different risks depending on where you move around the country. So can you talk a little bit about the larger risks or the smaller risks or what people need to think about depending on where they want to move?
Exactly. Basically the four big categories of risk, and this comes out of insurance loss kind of information, is wind, water, fire, and geoseismic. And geoseismic meaning earthquakes, landslides, subsidence, and maybe volcanoes. But throughout the whole country, no matter what state you're in, you're going to be facing water and fire risk. Even the deserts, flood once in a while, with heavy rainstorms. And even if you have a dry creek, close by, you're close to that bottom of the dry creek, in a flood, in a rain situation, that can flash flood very quickly. So, water and fire are prevalent anywhere. Urban fires, happen every day. In fact, we burn so many individual houses a year in the U.S., and I talk about that in my book, that we burn the equivalent of a city the size of Austin every year. But it doesn't get publicized because it's one here, one there. What you hear are the wildfires that burn entire communities. Then on top of that, you've got the wind hazard. And basically today, anything east of the Rockies is either going to be subject to tornadoes or hurricanes. And downbursts, again, can happen anywhere in the US. Those are typically winds up to 80, maybe 90 miles an hour. But when you're talking about hurricanes and tornadoes, you're up in the above 150, let's say, wind speed. So, you've got to take that into account, how the house was built, how the roof is, and that's the guide kind of tries to give you things to look at. For example, a low profile hip roof, meaning with slanted sides on every side of the building, will withstand wind better, much better than a gable roof that has kind of a triangular side. And how heavy that roof is and how well it's strapped onto the rest of the house, and if those straps go all the way to the foundation. So, there are things that you can ask about, you can find about. So the roof is the weakest part of any house or building. The second are the doors and the windows. Down in Miami where I live, everything is rated 170 plus mile per hour, but that's not the rest of the country. It's not even the rest of Florida. You go up to the Panhandle, and they're still installing things to a much lower standard, like 130, 140, and we know that they can get those Cat 4 and 5s too, not just South Florida.
In
And
our
tornadoes
previous
are happening
podcast,
everywhere.
sorry for in our previous podcast, I was just going to say, was about a couple who were buying a new home in Key West, Florida. And the number one thing that they did was their roof in order to reduce their insurance premiums. But even then, wind insurance is costing them more than $10,000 a year. Wind insurance. So we talked about water east of the Rockies.
Yeah,
What
water is everywhere. Wind is basically east of the Rockies, but water is everywhere in the country. And these are kind of different types of water risks. Obviously, the most severe is if you're on the Pacific coast and you're low enough to be hit by a tsunami, which for me is if you're less than 50 feet above the coast, you're going to be hit by that tsunami whenever it happens. And then you get into storm surges from hurricanes. And that's the whole Gulf and East coast of the U.S. is at risk of that. Flash flooding, river lake flooding. I like to say that anything less than 12 feet elevation difference from water, and that water could be either the sea or a lake or a river or even the bottom of a dry creek, anything less than 12 feet to me is a red flag. So, I like to stay away from that. Now, if you can't measure things, there's some good resources there. Unfortunately, the government's maps are outdated. They're not very good. I turn to a free resource called Flood Risk or Flood Factor, rather. So you can put in your address and find out what the rating is. Flood rating goes from 1 to 10. And I like to say anything higher than a 5 is, again, a red flag. So, water is the most expensive risk we have, and even a couple inches of water on your floor can do tens of thousands of dollars of damage.
Yeah. And for a lot of folks, flood insurance is either non-existent because the insurance companies have abandoned those high risk areas, or as in the case of my friends in Key West, it is hugely expensive for most homeowners. So you talked a little bit about fire, and I'm interested that you did put in a picture of an urban fire. Yeah, everybody talks about the wildfires because obviously they cover many acres and impact many people, and they also have an impact on the electricity grid and whatnot. But I was interested to hear you talk about the scale of fire in urban areas compared to a large scale wildfire.
Yeah, and this picture is just one example. The structure here may be fire resistant, but the cladding and the insulation that they've put on the building can be very vulnerable. And we saw that in London, that the Grenfell Towers that unfortunately was turned out to be a tragedy. Was a very resilient structure that they retrofitted later and added a combustible insulation to save energy and a cladding that was combustible that looked pretty. So the whole thing burned, and was destroyed. A lot of people lost their lives. And finally, geoseismic, and that primarily affects the West Coast. But there's an area a lot of people don't realize, centered around Memphis, that's also very geologically active, called the Madrid Fault. And unfortunately, they've not taken the measures as seriously as the West Coast has, and it'll be a tragedy when seismic hits that area. And landslides are a big factor, especially if a wildfire has burnt the vegetation and the trees. So if you get heavy rains, I mean that soil essentially will slip away, and so will any buildings built on it.
And that's what we're seeing here on the East Coast is saturated land from more rain, from larger rainstorms, not even hurricanes, just bigger rainstorms. And the land is utterly saturated. We're seeing basically landslides. We're seeing a tremendous amount of water runoff. And of course, we're also seeing damage to the trees. When the winds follow the saturated ground, the trees have nothing to hold on to. And so you're seeing the trees dropping on houses and power wires, et cetera.
Yeah.
So,
by the way, Ken, on that, I like to say anything on a slope more than 30 degrees to me is a red flag. I wouldn't build there. If it was me, I wouldn't build on a slope more than 30 degrees.
So we've talked a lot about the risks. what is a resilient house? What would you consider? If somebody came to you and said, I'm looking at buying a property, what is a resilient place? What are the factors?
Well, I think there are three factors here. One is the location, and that's half of the battle, or more than half of the battle, because if the location, let's say, was a former floodplain, or was built where a lake, they filled the lake, or is built too close to a river and so forth, you've got to spend a lot of money and you've got to make a big effort to make that resilient. So the location is the first kind of thing that I screen for, because most places that have been built on risky locations have not built to those standards that are needed, and therefore either they're going to be destroyed or somebody's going to have to spend a lot of money to raise those buildings and so forth. So you want to have a low risk location. You want to pick a location, as I mentioned, that's above 12 feet or rated on flood factor less than 5, and you want a location that's not on if you're in an earthquake area, you don't want a location that's filled on fill, because in an earthquake that turns into almost like a milkshake, a liquid, and buildings just fall on their side.
That's
You don't
exactly
want.
what happened in the big San Francisco quake that knocked out the Bay Bridge. The marina area had a lot of houses where you had the garage below and then 2 floors above, and the garages basically went down because the marina was all landfill, and that turned basically to quicksand, and that's why you had so many houses in that area collapse, be destroyed.
And I don't recommend being next to a dense forest. I know people are kind of, moving further away, but you're just asking for, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to make that fire resistant. So the location is number one. Number two is the construction. And does the construction mitigate for the location risks? So, as we said, fire and water are going to be pretty much everywhere. So, what's the elevation of your ground floor? What are your electric outlets, and your appliances and your AC? Are they elevated enough? What happens if water does enter? What kind of flooring do you have? I have a stone tile in my house and even stone sideboard, so I don't worry about water. And I'm at almost 15 feet elevation, even though I'm in South Florida. I picked intentionally to be there. So there are things you can do. What kind of siding do you have? For fire. I recommend people, if they don't have a concrete kind of house, at least put cement fiber siding on your house. The fire rating of your roof tiles, at least a grade A rated roof tile. And also the vegetation you have around your house. Do you have a safety zone so that things just don't, the surrounding of your house doesn't end up being, like a fire circling your house and, trying to catch everything. So there's a number of things, and those are the things that are kind of brought up in the guide also. And finally, we know that nothing, survives unless it's properly maintained. So diligent maintenance, fixing things when they're damaged, cracks, sealing the windows, the doors, a constant stream of things that every year you should be doing. And if you ignore them, some people think that insurance is a maintenance reserve for their roof. It's not. And the insurance companies are waking up and telling you, look, your roof was 20 years old. You should have replaced it. I'm only going to give you a few dollars, things like that.
Exactly,
So,
exactly.
don't expect that insurance is going to pay for your maintenance.
Yeah, interestingly, my brother lives in Australia. His backyard is basically the bush, and he is required to mow down his backyard area, which is rather large, every single year before the fire season starts. It is a requirement, it's not an option. He's got to get out there on his big mower and mow that down specifically to prevent, fire risk to his house. So you talked earlier about some of the cosmetics. I want to drill down on that just a little bit. When folks talk to builders or contractors about renovations or what have you, obviously they're going to want to sell you the prettiest things and whatnot. What do you mean by cosmetics sort of blinding you to resilience?
Yeah, I particularly focus on the property agents, that are trying to sell houses. The key thing that they focus on is how pretty the house looks from the curb, the closets, the countertops, the copper sink, the kitchen, amenities, the bathroom amenities. they really don't tell you, well, we're in a floodplain here, and sooner or later you're going to have to elevate this house, or this house was built to a pretty low standard for wind, because it was built, let's say, in 1960 or 1970, when the standards were maybe 90 miles an hour, and we know that that location is subject to winds that can go up to 150 miles an hour. They don't tell you these things, so that's what you've got to become, your own resilient smart detective, with the help of this guide, buyer's guide, because it's a buyer beware property market, and we've had generations of consumers that have grown up on the Better Home and Garden TV education of properties, which 99% of it focuses on cosmetics. So, people are not educated.
So what does it mean to be above the hazard? If somebody's looking at a home, what are those ratings? What should they be looking for? What kind of questions should they ask?
Well, for as I said, east of the Rockies, I would recommend being at 150 miles an hour, whether you're on the coast or whether you're inland, subject to tornado. I would not, feel safe in a house that's built less than that. So that means it means a couple things. The type of construction primarily is what affects that. Concrete being the most, solid construction, either block or the ICF, the concrete forms that are poured in. But if you do want to go with wood, at least have everything strapped down. There are metal straps that can be installed today to hold the trusses together, to hold the beams together, and cables that are taken from the roof all the way down the foundation. So at least get that. Hopefully that'll get you to 140. It probably won't get you to 150, but hopefully we'll get you to 140. When we're talking about waters, if you can, at all, at all preferences, pick a location that's above 12 feet. If you're below 12 feet, you've got to think of, what you're going to do with the house when it floods. Now, certain houses can be lifted, and we're seeing that happening kind of along the southern coast. A lot of houses in Houston have been lifted, one story up. It's expensive, and the bigger the house, the heavier the house, the more expensive it is. It may be more cost effective just tear it down and rebuild it. I mean, there's some other things like barriers and so forth, but water is probably one of the most expensive things to try to mitigate for. And if you're close to the California or Oregon coast, Washington coast, I would not want to live at elevations below 50 feet from that coast, because there's not much you can actually do to defend yourself from a tsunami other than run, from it. So your whatever property you have there will be destroyed. Fire rating, my preference would be to pick materials, the siding, the roof, even make sure that if you're using wood that it's fire treated, and I would ask for a 2-hour rating, the windows, the soffits, everything, that could face an outside fire, but also an inside fire. I like, the fire resistant curtains and fire resistant fabrics and, things inside, because fires can start from either direction. And finally, geoseismic. I mean, that gets a little bit more into engineering, but, we need to be building things that can withstand at least a 7 Richter earthquake. There's a lot of older buildings. I think California now has strengthened their new construction, but there's a lot of older buildings, the soft stories that we talk about that have the open garage underneath, and the top floors are sitting on those columns, thin columns, that's going to collapse, very easily. So, again, the strapping of the house is important there. This is a checklist actually pulled out of the guide for floods, since floods are very important, and we won't go through this in detail. But, if you can just, take a snapshot of this or make a copy of it and just check mark as you're looking around and searching neighborhoods and areas. It has 4 basic categories here, and you can fill it up, over your search time. One is the location. It's asking you a bunch of things to check off on the location. The second is the construction of the building itself. The third is suggestions on things you can do to upgrade if you're missing some of the earlier things that were brought up. And finally, so a small checklist on maintenance items, things that should be maintained on an annual basis. Now, what I'd like to suggest people is when they're looking around neighborhoods, they have these forms, and before they even, pick a house to make an offer on, they fill this out and then compare this along with all their other criteria, like, how the neighborhood is, how close the schools are, and so forth, and at least make a choice with their eyes open. The worst thing is for people to get surprised and say, I didn't know this. I didn't know I was going to flood. I didn't know this house was going to burn or it was going to be blown away. That's the worst thing that can happen. At
We
least go in with your eyes open.
we talk a lot about it. The introduction to my book is inevitable surprises. We know all of this stuff. We've seen all of this. We've got the data. Nobody should be surprised. So if anybody would like to learn more, the buyer's guide is free on the website, buildingresilient.com. You can also connect and donate to their fund. You can buy this book on Amazon. There's also a PBS documentary called Built to Last. We'll be posting additional information on the blog, including the checklist with link back to Aris's website, so folks can find it that way. And the last thing we want to focus on here is there's also the concept of you are becoming more financially resilient. You got to make your house more resilient, but you also need to think about your finances. There was a recent Chubb survey done that said that 76% of their customers cited exposure to extreme weather caused by climate change as the #1 risk to their homes. So folks, if you're listening to this, you're not alone. Everybody is really concerned about this. And we recommend that you do 3 things. Number 1, create and update a 5-year financial plan, assuming that you're going to get hit with at least 1 and perhaps 2 major losses from some sort of severe weather within that time frame. Number 2, you want to optimize your insurance coverage. Yes, a lot of insurance companies have exited high-risk areas, but there's a lot of options that you can use to help protect you in the event of a storm. Insurance is not going away, but you need to talk to your insurance agent about other things that you can do to protect yourself. And then lastly, and this really speaks to Aris's book, invest time and money in event cost mitigation. Hardening your home, getting a new roof, new windows, storm shutters, things like that. They'll make a big difference. When something hits, you'll be in a much better position to be able to recover financially. So in addition to Aris's book, which is wonderful, I've read it, it's great. That checklist is fantastic. If you're buying a home, you should get that checklist. And I think this is a great complementary book, specifically looking at the finances. And we also delve into the impact, not only on personal finances, but the impact on the wealth of the nation. So our time is up. I want to say thank you very much to Aris for spending all this time with us today. And if anybody would like to learn more, please go to our website. We have additional podcasts coming out about once every other week. So thank you, everybody, very much. And we will talk to you again soon.
Thank you.